This weekend we saw the first sprint qualifying event in Formula One's history, and after much speculation in advance of the event, I think most people actually enjoyed it and what sprint racing added to the whole weekend of Formula One action. But now we've seen it in practice, are sprint races a good thing for Formula One? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A significant structural change in the Formula One race weekend is always going to create controversy. In this video, I'll share my view on sprint qualifying, including looking at the winners and losers of the event, and also whether it's a good thing for Formula One as a whole. And as always, make sure to leave the video a like and hit the subscribe button for more in the future. Silverstone Sprint Qualifying. The sprint qualifying event was a landmark moment for Formula One, and in particular for the new management of the sport in Stefano Domenicali and Ross Brawn. It put qualifying on a Friday evening, with the results of that determining the starting order for sprint qualifying, which had points for the top three finishers and set the starting grid for the Grand Prix. The weekend changes meant that essentially the free practice 3 session was replaced by the sprint race, which I think everyone would agree is a good thing. I know for sure that I wouldn't be too bothered if I was to have missed free practice 3, but there's no way I would have been missing sprint qualifying. So there's no doubt that this change will have been a good thing for TV ratings and fan engagement with the sport. Ross Brawn even said that the F1 TV streaming service had experienced a 3-fold increase of Friday viewers. Whether this impact would last over time is another matter, and given global time zones, having the qualifying event on an evening in the local area could well mean that qualifying is on during work or school hours on a Friday for some people. This is obviously not an ideal outcome, and as someone based in the UK, it's something that would affect me if there was a weekend like this in the Eastern Hemisphere. I'm really intrigued if this affected any of you. Based on my YouTube analytics, over 20% of people who watch my videos are from the USA. So let me know in the comments if having sprint qualifying during the working day affected you. The thing with Friday qualifying though was that it felt like it meant less. Lewis Hamilton put in the quickest time, and of course all the drivers were trying to get their car as high up the order as possible for the best chance on Saturday. But, despite being the quickest, Hamilton won't go down in the history books as achieving the pole position because he lost out during the sprint race. He was instead awarded with the Speed King Award, which felt like it was a bit of a nothing prize. Sure, he was also in the best starting position for the sprint qualifying event, but it felt like there was an asterisk on qualifying, which can be some of the best action on a weekend. Then came the race itself, and I know that the organisers of the event didn't want it to be called a race, but that's exactly what it was. It was 30 minutes of fast-paced action that took a lot of the strategy away and basically forced the drivers to push for the entire 100-kilometre event. A combination of free tyre choice and low fuel meant that all drivers had the chance to go for it, whilst also knowing that taking risks would be particularly costly if they didn't pay off. Most drivers went for the medium tyre, and I think that shows why it was great to have this event at a circuit that has traditionally high tyre wear. Had this been at a track that is less abrasive on tyres, then there would have been no strategic elements at all. So I think it would be something that Formula One needs to consider in the future if they run this weekend structure again. A few drivers did go for the soft compound tyres, including Mercedes' Valtteri Bottas, who took a gamble on his tyres in an attempt to get a quicker start and get past Max Verstappen, who started ahead of him. In the end, this gamble didn't pay off, but at the same time he didn't lose out to Charles Leclerc behind him, so it was worth it for him and the Mercedes team in their fight against Verstappen and Red Bull. But this also touches on a potential improvement to the event. If they'd have made the race last for a bit longer, maybe 150 kilometres instead of 100, there might have been more of an incentive for a driver to go for it with a pit stop. It would need to be a track with high tyre wear, and maybe that isn't the point of the shorter race format, but I would be intrigued to see it in practice and whether anyone would give a counter strategy a try. The winners and losers. We can also look at the winners and losers from the sprint qualifying race. And for starters, we can see that there are always going to be some drivers and teams that would benefit from this format. This weekend's race saw Fernando Alonso and Alpine in particular doing a stellar job of making up for a poor qualifying on Friday. The Spanish driver went from 11th to 7th, and that makes a big difference to his and the team's prospects. More generally on this, there are drivers who are known to perform better in races than they do in qualifying. So in general, I'd expect the likes of Antonio Giovinazzi, Lance Stroll, and Sergio Perez to like this format. Which brings us nicely onto the losers of the event in sprint qualifying, as taking risks often leads to costly errors. And whilst I do believe that Perez will do better more generally from this format, this weekend he was the biggest loser of them all after his trip off the track through Chapel, where he almost ended up in the barrier. This kind of crash shows how costly a small error like this can be, and yes, it would be the same in a normal race, but having 3 competitive events adds that level of adversity for drivers. Often Formula 1 fans want more mixed up grids, and some people even say that they'd want reverse grids in the sport. I would argue that adding this extra competitive session will more often throw out an unexpected outcome, like Sergio Perez starting at the back of the order for the Sunday race. Building on this point, had a driver had an incident during free practice 1 and significantly damaged their car, they would have likely put themselves in jeopardy for the entire weekend, as they'd have dropped to the back for sprint qualifying and then had to work their way back up the order over the 2 races. This format adds significant penalties to mistakes, which is something that personally I'm a big fan of. These teams were saying before the race that drivers wouldn't be willing to take too many risks, and that it would likely be a train of cars. But as is the way with Formula 1 drivers, they'll refuse to go down without a fight, and are always going to fight for the next position. Another loser from the sprint qualifying event this weekend was Carlos Sainz, who got caught up in a first lap incident with George Russell as the Ferrari driver attempted to make his way up the order from 9th on the grid, a poor qualifying position by his standards. But after contact between the 2 drivers, he was left right back down the order in a race against time to get himself back to a reasonable spot to start the Grand Prix. He managed to get back to 11th, but really it shows that any incidents on sprint qualifying Saturday could create more mixed up grids than the traditional qualifying events. Finally, more generally, the other losers from this type of event will be the drivers that tend to be very quick over one lap. George Russell, for example, has been doing a fantastic job in his Williams car to get it into Q3 at each of the last 2 events, and through to Q2 at every race this season. But every time, he's fighting in the race to cling on to every position, and often very quickly falls back down the order towards the backmarkers. All this sprint qualifying event did for him was give him 17 more laps to defend from the cars behind. Lewis Hamilton also lost out, given he was mighty over 1 lap pace, but really he looked way behind Max Verstappen once it got into the race conditions. It's meant that Max Verstappen is the first ever driver, as far as I'm aware, to be the pole sitter despite being the 2nd fastest qualifier. Is sprint qualifying good for Formula 1? So we've seen how the sprint qualifying race went at Silverstone and my opinion of it, but is the event a good thing for the sport more generally? Well, I think for starters we need to consider the fact that Ross Brawn has stated that this won't be a permanent change. He sees it more as a set of 6 pinnacle events that are akin to that of tennis Grand Slams. Now this is a good idea. I think it's quite clear that this wouldn't work at every race. For example, it definitely wouldn't be a success at Monaco. It does add a bit of a risk though, in that historically F1 likes to follow the money, and that's the main reason that the final race at each season is hosted in Abu Dhabi. My concern would be that Formula 1 might sell these sprint races to the highest bidder, which is absolutely the wrong way to go in my view. As I've already mentioned, I think that tracks with high tyre degradations should be targeted primarily, as they will add that extra element of strategy to a sprint qualifying weekend. So to have them occasionally, but not always, would probably be the best outcome in my view. I think that having a weekend with more competitive sessions is also a great thing, as it keeps the fans engaged for a longer period of time. However, I must say that for new fans of the sport, it would probably be quite challenging to explain. So I think this could use some work. Perhaps calling the top driver in qualifying the pole sitter is a good start, and giving them that record and then calling the sprint race what it is, which is a race. You can then say that the outcome from that sets the grid for the Grand Prix. I think that there could also be an opportunity to test out giving out points to drivers further down the grid in the sprint event. This would perhaps provide an extra incentive for people to go for a move where they might not have done in the midfield positions. Having points for the top 3 is most likely going to end up with the same drivers getting it each and every time, who won't really be in a fight with anyone else. But going for the top 6 might make a bit of a difference. Making these tweaks for the other test events in 2021, for me, would be progress, and show that Formula 1 is listening to the fans. I think it would be a shame if they tried the exact same event, but in a different place. Overall, I enjoy the fact that they've tried something different and given the weekend a bit more excitement. Sure, there are elements that I disagree with and would change if I could, but I would say that this weekend's action was a massive success. What did you think of sprint qualifying? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video and watched this far, then leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more videos like this one in the future.